One limitation on the difference principle is that it only applies to the basic structure. Right? That is, it's used to evaluate the fundamental economic, political, social structures of society. It does not apply to personal decisions, specific judicial rulings, or for the most part, ordinary laws. So we don't use it to decide our litter laws. Right? We might not use it to decide everything about regulation. And we might not even use it to set the rate of the minimum wage or the current interest rate. What we would do is use it to decide whether we will have a minimum wage in the first place, or whether anybody will be charged with the responsibility of setting the interest rate. So it might not determine every policy of the Federal Reserve, but it will determine whether or not we will have a Federal Reserve. I bring this point up because it becomes a point of confusion. In particular, one philosopher that I really admire has gotten Rawls completely wrong on this point. There's a philosopher named Alasdair MacIntyre who criticizes Rawls. And he says that the difference principle doesn't work for the following reason. He gives an example involving a Native American group, I believe somewhere on the East Coast, that discovered a treaty which would give them the right to a certain amount of land. MacIntyre said, you can't apply the difference principle to this case. Why? Because who is the worst off depends on how the judge rules, whether they honor the treaty or invalidate it. Now, there's two difficulties here. One is that the difference principle deals with this. Right? It says, okay, if group A is worse off on option 1, and group B is worse off on option 2, right? Well, you look at group A, how badly off group A is in option 1 and how badly off group B is in option 2. You compare them, you figure out which one is better for the group that's least well off under that particular system, right? And you choose that one. The second, and for our purposes more important point, is that this probably wouldn't apply to that particular judicial decision, right? The judge isn't supposed to sit there and say, well, what does the difference principle say? The difference principle applies to things like, under what conditions do we honor our treaties? Right? So do we honor them strictly, or do we say something about the passage of time? Right? Do we sometimes say, okay, given a certain amount of economic disruption, we're going to substitute the treaty with some other agreed upon form of compensation, etc. Right? So it's important to remember the difference principle applies to fundamental questions about the basic structure, not to very specific decisions in the ordering of society. And this goes back to the idea of a conception of justice. The conception of justice is there to critique the basic structure. And the basic structures are the fundamental rules within which people make their choices and try to live out their life as best they can in society. Right? You don't go back to the conception of justice for every single detail of how people live their lives.